Statements here in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. We'll be starting today a kind of a series about some of the beliefs of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. One of the things you discover when you go back to the Disciples of Christ, we are a denomination that was born on American soil, even though we do have kind of our Scottish Presbyterian background in many of us. But we were born because of two different groups. One was the Campbells, who came from Scotland, who came to the United States. The Father Thomas was a Presbyterian minister, and as he was assigned parishes up in what was then the western frontier, which is Ohio and western Pennsylvania, as he went around preaching to different places as they gathered for worship each Sunday, he would preach in a different place most of the time each week, and there they would serve communion. But because of the background of him and his denomination, he could only serve communion to those Presbyterians who were a part of that denomination. So even though the whole community would gather to hear because, quote, there was a minister in town, because it was something they did not have every week, he had to ask the others to leave when they did communion. And he didn't think that was right, and so he began to say all people who follow Christ should be a part of that, and that kind of got him in trouble with his superiors. His son Alexander had a similar feeling over in Scotland and left when he came. They both talked about that and began a ministry there in the western Pennsylvania and Ohio that would become known as the Christian Church. The other section of us comes from Kentucky, once again on the western frontier, where in 1812 there was a great revival meeting at Cane Ridge. If you've been to Cane Ridge, it was in a log cabin church, that was the church. It probably holds 50 if you crowd them in. So the meeting, which had thousands, was not in the church, but rather on the grounds there of the beautiful bluegrass country of Kentucky. And thousands came, and there were preaching everywhere all of the time. It was kind of like you could pick and choose where you wanted to go and listen to someone who was preaching. And when one person would get done preaching, someone else who felt the Spirit move would get up and start to preach there. And that sense was, once again, that was Barton Stone, and he saw how this was bringing people together from different phases and walks of life. And so he began to think that the church should not have any real sense of boundaries, but rather the church should be. But yet in starting this, they become known as what was a covenant people. They did not believe that we should have any formal creed, but what should unite us together as people should be covenants. Of course, covenants go back a long way in the Old Testament. The first we remember is God's covenant with Abraham, where he tells Abraham he will make him a great nation. Of course, the great sign of the covenant that most of us remember is the covenant God made with Noah after the flood, when he said, I will put a rainbow in the sky, and there my people will know that I will not once again destroy the world with water. A covenant that many of us look to for a sign of hope even in our darkest days. And I can remember when I was an associate in Kirksville, Missouri, right out of seminary, we were having a sense of morning prayer meetings once a week in a local restaurant, and we had gathered one morning there to pray together as a church. And the senior minister informed us that one of the great leaders of our church had been killed in an automobile accident the night before as he was coming back from a Qantas deal over in Hannibal, Missouri. Of course, we were all concerned about this, and the day was dark and gloomy and cloudy. But late that afternoon, there appeared in the eastern sky a beautiful rainbow. And we often talked about that as a sign of hope in the midst of our darkness. But here we talk about covenants, and of course today we see in the Old Testament of Moses renewing the covenant with the people of Israel. This is one of his last acts that he will do while he is still alive on earth. But he brings them together to remind them that they were a chosen people. that from their ancestors they had come and that God had delivered them even from the land of Egypt. It was a sense of reminding them that it is God who initiates the covenant and calls us to be a covenant people, which means we are to live in a relationship with God and in a relationship with others round about us. And that is what our leaders of the Christian church, disciples of Christ, said that we should be built upon, is that sense of our own covenant with God and with one another, with all Christians, that we are to live under God, but we are to live in relationship with one another and to tear down those walls that divide us. And that's what they saw the creeds doing, and so that's why they came with this one great statement, no creed but Christ. They reminded us as people we were called to be God's people, all of us, and so they chose the name Christian for us. Not because they thought we were any greater, because as our slogan goes, we are Christians only, not the only Christian. That we are Christians is what really matters. Not any other title should separate us. But we are not the only Christians. That means that we can love and work and share with others who profess Christ. And we can invite them to our table. We can invite them to join with us in a sense of ministry and mission. And so that has been our symbol as we begin to grow in what it meant to be a group of people of God. When the two groups, the Stones and the Campbells, came together in 1834, all they needed was a handshake. They wanted no formal papers. They said, we will unite and we will use the handshake as a symbol of that, because we will live in a covenant with each other. We will work with each other. We will learn from one another, and we will build up one another in the name of Christ. And yet it was during that time, of course, the people wanted a faith that allowed them a sense of freedom here in our country. Many had left the oppressiveness of many different things in their home countries, and sometimes religion was one. But they had come to develop a new sense of hope in this new world, and so they began to want this sense of freedom where they could come and study and understand for themselves. And maybe even could disagree with one another, but still not put each other down or not see that each one was not a part of God's kingdom. They could have maybe some slight different beliefs, but yet join together around the table of God. They could work with each other. They could pray with each other. They could be God's people together when they lived in a sense of covenant. But what does it mean for us today when we see that there is so much maybe divisiveness among churches and within churches? We need to be reminded that we still live in covenant with each other. That we live under God, but we also live in relationship with those round about us. Where we have a sense of diversity and understanding of what it means to be the church of God. This worked well for us when we began our mission movement back several centuries ago. When we as disciples, when we looked at doing missions, what overseas as we would call it, we began to look and say, when we go to a different country, instead of trying to bring our styles of worship, our styles and our understanding of church, what we should do is bring the good news of Jesus Christ and allow the indigenous people there to develop that and to develop their styles of worship as they please. To allow it to be their church. All we are there to teach and to train and to be messengers for them. And so when we went, we discovered that things are very different in other parts of the world, but the good news is the gospel can spread. And actually we have more people affiliated with the disciples of Christ on the continent of Africa than we do in the continent of America now. But it was that sense of allowing it to spread. I had a good friend who made a trip of missions to Ghana. And he's talked about going there to work and to share with the Ghananese Christians, that there he talks about the worship service. As he said, when we came to worship, it's not quite like it is in the United States. You know, we come to worship at 8 o'clock or 10:15 on Sunday morning. He said their worship time is kind of when everyone gets together. They don't have a set time. Time is not that important to them. They kind of start gathering and they wait around, and when everyone most people have gathered, they start singing. And he said they do lots of singing, joyful singing, and lots of praying. And then they do, of course, the preaching, which may go on for quite some time. But then he talked about then they come to take the offering. And they don't come down the aisle with plates and pass them around or baskets or anything like that. When it is time for the offerings, because there are two taken. One is for the work of the local church, and one is for their mission projects around about them. But when you come to give your offering, even though most of these are poor, you start and you dance down the aisle with your offering to put it in a basket that is up front. And then you go back and you do it for the second offering. I wonder how we would be if we tried dancing down the aisle to give our offerings. I know this minister would not be one to lead you. I would probably trip several of you up. I have two left feet. But it is that sense of what it means with joy. But that was them, as he said. That was their worship. And yet we felt a part of that, for we knew we had a kinship and a covenant to be in ministry with them, with a sense of what it means to be God's people. And even the growth in our church, the Christian church disciples in the United States, is more now with what we would call ethnic groups. Especially the two largest groups that we see growth in are the Hispanic group and then the Asian group that we have. Now, of course, in the Hispanic group, I remember when we were serving in Tucson, and the first Hispanic church became a part of the Arizona region. It was with our good friend Gilberto Morales, Iglesia Cristiana Ebenezer. I still remember that name. And I remember when Gilberto got up to lead us in singing in our first regional assembly that we welcomed them to join with us. He got up and he said to us very bluntly, "The Lord God speaks in many languages. There are no barriers to the language he speaks. But when he sings in Spanish." And there he led us in some rousing singing, some beautiful singing with a great soul. But yet it is through that sense, but we understand also that even in the Hispanic traditions, there are very many different groups, many from the Mexico or Central America, but others from Puerto Rico. We have a large church gatherings in Puerto Rico. We have always had a lot of work there. And we also have those Cuban disciples who have immigrated to our country. So even they are different. Their worships are different, but yet we come together as God's children, as God's people. And while most of them worship in a rather freer style of worship, normally not with bulletins, lots of singing, lots of letting the Spirit move as they worship. Then we have the other group, the Pacific Islander, the Asian groups, especially those from Korea and other parts who have a very structured style of worship as is their lifestyle. And they would not think of coming dressed casual to worship, but would dress in suits and ties and very high dress for a very formal, very intellectual service. And then most of us within the other communities, we kind of feel somewhere in between. Some of our churches have a very more contemporary worship. Some have less structure in their worship. Some are very formal. But what unites us is that sense that we know we live in covenant with one another. Not only within our local congregations where we work together, but within other churches as we work through our regional and general ministries. We are called to be God's people together, to live in covenant, to look at those things that brings us together, which is the grace found in Jesus Christ. and not to those small things that sometimes we argue about that separate us. The good news is when we have all kinds of people lead studies of what churches have to offer today, they come back and say the church with the best theology for today is the Christian church disciples of Christ. Now the challenge for us is that we have got to live out that philosophy, that covenant with each other, that covenant that we profess, that we join together in the covenant of grace. In that covenant that God gives to us, we join together and allow the divisive things to somehow move away, not to allow them to divide us either locally or as we work with others throughout the world. For we are not the only Christians, but we are Christians only. And let's not let our own idiosyncrasies get in the way. Let us be a people who covenant with God, who see that it is God who has brought us together, that it is God who speaks and moves with us. And God calls us to live in relationship one with another. For the Christ we serve is the one who came to redeem all and to give all hope. Thanks be to God for that redeeming gift and for the covenant of love which binds us to one another. Amen.